Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming out in this marvelous, typical April weather for us in Minnesota. I'm trying to convince Chris that this is what it's actually like here most of the time. And thank you for coming. This is our second residency for the Nicholas and Bernice Reuter Professorship in Science and Religion here at St. John's and the College of St. Benedict. And it is my distinct pleasure tonight to welcome our scholar for this year, who is Dr. Christopher Southgate. And I have known Chris for about 7 or 8 years, and I find him to be one of the bravest thinkers and scholars I know. We met in that typical meeting place. We met in Tehran at a conference, and I got to know Chris, who was the bad boy of the conference. He was forever slipping away from our minders and hailing a taxi and heading off to meet the people and see the town. How do I know that? Because I was about 2 feet behind him. So we did Tehran together, and I think we've been firm and fast friends ever since. The other thing that I find most congenial about Chris is the breadth of his interests. Chris began his academic training as a biochemist, and he received his PhD from Cambridge. And after doing some postdoctoral research, he gave up the sciences, and he turned to writing, and to publishing, to writing and editing poetry. Chris then trained for the Anglican ministry, and he has served as a chaplain both at the University of Exeter and in various mental health settings. And he is now the acting principal and the dean of studies of an ecumenical ministerial training program at Exeter. In his spare time, he's published 4 volumes of poetry, and he's won a few prizes for that as well. So here you have a man who is running all sides of his brain at once, doing science, doing literature, doing ministry, and publishing at the same time. He has 2 books published in the field of science and religion, and his one book that he'll be talking about tonight, The Groaning of Creation, is considered to be the best study that looks at the question that I think lies right at the heart of the intersection of science and religion. And this is the other reason why I say he's such a brave man. He has taken on the hardest question there is, and that is, how could a God who is both all-powerful and all-loving have created a nature that is so red in tooth and claw? So please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Southgate.
Well, thank you so much, Noreen, for that generous, over-generous introduction. And it is a delight to be with you all tonight. It's splendid to be at St. John's. It's lovely to have the sponsors of Noreen's chair with us tonight. That's a great privilege. And there's also the opportunity for us to talk together about this great question between now and 9 o'clock. And when I say talk with each other, I do mean that in that I welcome interruptions, and questions. Don't feel you have to wait till the end if there's something that's really bothering you about what I'm saying. I'd much rather engage in a conversation than hear myself talk for ages. So bear that in mind, and if you get truly outraged by what I'm saying, stick up your hand and ask a question. If you're not outraged by the end, I'll be significantly disappointed. The question that confronts us is this question on the screen. How come a God whom Christians claim to be good and loving could have given rise to a natural world in which creatures routinely tear one another apart and inflict on each other great suffering? And what I'm going to try and do tonight is, first of all, to explain how that character of that question has changed with the development of evolutionary biology, to pin down exactly what the problem is as precisely as we can, to offer a range of ways of thinking about it which I think are helpful, and maybe, if we have time, to indicate why a whole series of other answers you might have been thinking of giving won't work. So that's our agenda tonight, and let's get started and see how we get on. So the first, I am not, by the way, a specialist on cheetahs, but I use them because they're a very handy illustration of what I'm talking about. If anyone here is a specialist on cheetahs, then just bear with me and put me right later on. But what I want to start by doing is looking at this cheetah and, first of all, to look at it as someone in 1800, before the advent of evolutionary theory and Darwin, how cheetah might have been understood by a Christian considering the issue of hunting and predation and suffering in nature in the year 1800. And it seems to me that these are some of the things that you might have thought in 1800 about this. If you've been a good Thomist, you might have been thinking, point one, that it's good for creation to be as rich and diverse as possible and to contain the maximum number of different ways of being a creature, including being that exceptional hunter that cheetahs are. And in order to be themselves, to pursue their telos, cheetahs must do what they do. They must run animals down and tear them apart. So you might be giving that sort of Thomist answer, but you would have been inclined to think that God had arrived at the cheetah by special creation one Thursday morning, and as a result, Thursday was the predator day, and God thought, well, it'd be jolly nice to have this range of predators, and we'll have cheetahs into the bargain. So you might have thought that sort of thing, or you might have thought, and this is a very ancient and persuasive way for Christians to think, you might have thought everything was fine in Eden until the human beings sinned, and then the whole of the natural world was corrupted by that sin, and that's the reason why we have such disturbing features of nature. So that would be an alternative, a fall-based approach to creaturely suffering, to natural evil. And you might have been thinking, well, maybe this problem doesn't really exist, because maybe animals other than human beings don't really have the capacity to feel pain, or don't really, if they feel pain, have the capacity to suffer. So maybe this is a non-issue. And that's also an answer that you find quite a bit in the history of Christian thought, that other animals don't really matter because they don't really feel things the way human beings do. So now I want to tell you that in the light of Darwinian thought, evolutionary biology as it's developed since the origin of species, that all of those answers have to be changed. First of all, you can still be, you'll be delighted to know, a good Thomist after 1859, but you have to notice the way that Darwinian theory has ratcheted up the question, because it's not just that God thought of hunting creatures on a Thursday morning. It is that we now know that creatures have come to be the way they are through a long evolutionary process which discarded all the unsuccessful versions. So the only cheaters we see are fast cheaters because all the slow cheaters starved. So all the excellent qualities in creatures are the product of this process of refinement, which discarded the weak and unfit over millions of years. So it's almost now looks as though God, rather than having a thought on a Thursday morning, actually used suffering and the discarding of the weak in order to give rise to the sort of creation that we see now. So suffering begins to look like a means to the divine end, a deeply troubling notion. We are in a position to discard, I believe, the notion that everything on earth was ever harmonious and lovely, that there was ever a pain-free or a predation-free biosphere. There's not the slightest evidence for that in the evolutionary record. Rather, we see, long before there were human beings, we see saber-toothed predators ideally adapted to ripping other creatures apart. Long before there were humans, we see evidence of disease, arthritis, for instance, in the bones of dinosaurs and so on. So the notion that human sin was a major contributor to these disvalues in evolution, to suffering or disease, has to be abandoned. It simply will not work. So a whole strategy for thinking about evil has to be discarded in relation to this sort of problem. And lastly, maybe animals don't suffer. Well, all the accumulating evidence of animal behavior and neurophysiology suggests that indeed animals react to trauma in ways very similar to human beings, and that what goes through their bodies is very similar to what you see going through the bodies of human beings who are experiencing severe pain and distress. So although we can never know how another sort of animal experiences its world, it's very important to realize how limited our knowledge is. Although we can never know how another sort of animal experiences its world, all the guesses point to the notion that other animals can experience severe distress, which is analogous to what a human would feel in the same sort of situation. Of course, there are lots of things that other animals can't feel. They can't feel that in a year's time they might lose their job. They can't feel dread at the possibility that in 10 years' time their parent might experience dementia or something like that. There are all sorts of aspects of human experience that other animals can't possibly feel. But in terms of the reactions they feel to being in severe trauma and the distress they evince, it seems a very good guess that indeed animals must suffer. And I'll go into that in a little more detail later. But you can see then, just to summarize this bit, you can see that fall-based explanations of natural evil won't work, that dismissing animal suffering won't work, and that seeing, reflecting on the process of natural selection will suggest that indeed maybe God uses suffering to further the divine ends. So I hope I've convinced you that the problem that you sat down to think about is, if anything, worse than when you sat down to think about it. Another way of putting that is to think that this world is a profoundly ambiguous world. The world of nature is full of value and beauty, adaptation, diversity, intricacy, but it is also full of the disvalues of suffering and of extinction. And I like to show this picture, and I'd like to try and get some reactions from people. So if you just bear with me for a moment. Most people are prepared to concede that this is a beautiful picture. Very few people, in my experience, don't think that that's a beautiful picture. But what I want to know from you, if you can bear to tell me, is whether that is a beautiful picture. No? I hear a no. It's survival of the fittest, yes, certainly, yes.
I think we're a little too inclined to identify with the prey animal.
Right.
To find it beautiful, right? We put ourselves in that place and not so beautiful.
Okay. So it's yes, thank you. So please. Noble. Ah, that's a very interesting word, isn't it? A noble picture. Why is that a noble picture? Dan?
Both sides, both the eland and I guess I put this, and the cheetah doing what they do.
Right. Every audience has got to have one.
Could you say that ultimately the cheetah the animal species stronger?
Absolutely, yes. And there's a beautiful quotation by the biologist Holmes Rolston about this subject when he says, the cougar's fang has carved the limb of the fleet-footed deer. It's a lovely quote. The cougar's fang has carved the limb of the fleet-footed deer, and vice versa. So in other words, these creatures have refined each other over millennia through the struggles of predator and prey. So I think this is both a very disturbing picture because the antelope is trapped and experiences trauma, not just for a second or two, but probably for a minute while all this is going on. It's also a beautiful and elegant picture because it shows cheetah education. The mother cheetah hobbles the back leg of the prey animal so that the cubs can learn how to pull a big animal down. And we all, I think, here believe in education. And without that education, and this is perhaps a little different from the human context, but without that level of education, those cubs will starve. So it's a beautiful and necessary picture, but also, I think, a picture of suffering and in its way, quite a disturbing picture. Of course, if we could see the face of the antelope, I think we would find it yet more disturbing still. So what I'm trying to say from this is that there's a profound level of ambiguity in the natural world, that value is bound up with suffering, and that indeed value is, in terms of the sophistication of creatures, is increased by processes which are driven by suffering. So, this is then a profoundly ambiguous world, a world which in biblical terms might be regarded both as very good, the verdict of the culmination of the Genesis 1 creation story, both very good and also groaning. I want to call my book The Good and the Groaning, but publishers, being what they are, they wouldn't let me, so it had to be The Groaning of Creation. But my point is this ambiguity in the natural world, that it is both good and full of suffering. As I say on this slide, we can see this ambiguity already in the Bible. There's evidence both of creation praising God, but also of God giving the young lions their food and providing for the raven and the eagle and so forth. And yet beyond that, there's very difficult passages to handle. I'm not sure whether we shall get there or not, but there's very difficult passages in Isaiah promising something different, a peaceable kingdom. Darwin, too, was very exercised by this ambiguity which had became so clear to him in the course of his work. And so he can write painfully this famous Devil's Chaplain quote of the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horridly cruel works of nature, and yet of the grandeur in this view of life, in which a few simple natural laws can give rise to the amazing world that we see. So Darwin already was very clear about this ambiguity and very troubled by it. The lurking theist within him had all sorts of difficulties with the natural world that he saw. So, I hope that was enough introduction to assure you that there's a real problem here, that the natural world is profoundly ambiguous, and that we can't blame it all on the fall or something like that. It's all down to God, basically. So now what I want to do is to refine the problem so that we're exactly clear what we're talking about, and then I'll try and offer you some ways of thinking theologically through this difficulty. So I think we've established clearly that that pain is a reality in other creatures. Does that matter? Well, if God loves God's creation, then surely it must matter profoundly that those creatures suffer. It can't not matter. I don't understand those people who say that this, from a theological point of view, that this is not an issue. Because if God loves creatures, then their suffering must be a concern to God. Is the fact that such a large proportion of all the ways of being alive in the world are extinct, is that a loss of value in the biosphere? Well, I would say yes. So we've got a problem which I call the problem of evolutionary evil, to distinguish it from the other forms of natural evil and moral evil. I don't by that mean in any sort of way that it's the product of evil or demonic forces. I just use that term in a technical way to describe the problem that we're addressing. So, these are the three aspects of the problem as I see them. The first of all is the bare existence of all this suffering, the ontological aspect. God gave rise to, in classical Christian thought, to everything that exists. Therefore, if there is all this suffering, then God is to blame for it on a simple ontological level. It's a serious charge against the goodness of God simply from the existence of all the suffering. But the problem is yet worse when we consider the possibility that the suffering was instrumental in generating values within the creation. In other words, if God had purposes for the creation and the purposes required this suffering-filled process, then there's a teleological aspect to the problem. God seems to have used suffering to further the divine ends. And lastly, what... Yeah, please. Yeah.
Could part of that be the double effect? He didn't intend the suffering. I mean, he didn't intend, it's not, that's kind of what happens, it's a secondary thing.
That's a possibly helpful move, but that would be okay if the suffering is just a byproduct of the process giving rise to the values. But I think the suffering is more deeply woven into the problem because evolution depends on the weak going to the wall, the slow cheetah starving. So it's not just a kind of accidental byproduct, but deeply ingrained in the process. So I'm very sympathetic with your view, but I don't think it's quite enough. Please. Yes, I think that's a very good point. When I wrote the book, I was very preoccupied with extinction for some reason. And the more I think about it, the more I think that maybe I did overvalue that element. I think there is suffering. There may be increased levels of suffering for particular creatures as they find that they are the last remnant of a species. In the book I talk about the so-called hobbit man in Indonesia, the last of our relatives to become extinct, and how there might have been significant levels of distress attached to finding that you were the last hobbit people. But I think the other reason why I think extinction is a disvalue is because every species is a kind of strategy for being alive, and therefore it might be said a way in which God's creativity is praised. Every time that's lost, there is a loss to the biosphere. So it's not so much that it's not all about suffering, but it is about loss as well. But your point is well taken, though. Thank you. So what I'm wanting to say then is there's a basic ontological aspect to this problem. There's a teleological ratchet of it because of the way in which suffering is intrinsic to the evolutionary process. And there's also a question as to what on earth the theology of redemption has to contribute to this problem. And I just want, for a moment, to give you another biological example, just to indicate my point about the teleological problem. And I'll be interested to know whether you think double effect will do in this case. Because here's the white pelican and a white pelican chick. This is a favorite example of Holmes' Ralston's. And as with many other birds of prey, pelicans hatch two chicks. The elder chick is almost always the stronger, and the younger chick is just an insurance. So in almost every case, what happens is that as the elder chick becomes strong, it pushes the younger chick to the edge of the nest and then pushes it out. Once it's out of the nest, the parents ignore it and it starves. So this is a very successful evolutionary strategy, because you have the insurance. If anything happens to the older chick, you've got the younger one to fall back on. So all is well. But in almost every case, the younger chick experiences nothing but distress and starvation. So that's what I mean about how the suffering is woven into the strategy. This works well for the species, but badly, I think you'll agree, for the insurance chick. The suffering is intrinsic to the process. So just once again to clarify what precisely I'm driving at, I'm not wanting to say that pain is of itself an evil, because pain is a necessary biological instrument. None of us can do without it. We need to avoid harmful stimuli. So we've got to have pain. The pain of itself is not the problem. And death, I want to say, is not necessarily an evil. If it follows flourishing in a life, then doesn't seem to me that death is of itself an evil. But what I am trying to persuade you of is such a thing as suffering in the natural world, and that it occurs particularly when creatures are subject to chronic or acute pain, when they're trapped, or fear that they're going to be trapped, when, like the antelope, they have no possibility of escape, and yet their levels of pain and fear get to be high. That's what I mean by suffering in creatures. We find it also in the insurance pelican chick, as it simply starves itself to death. So there's a particular problem in speaking of a good and loving God, where the lives of creatures like the insurance pelican chick seem to be all suffering and no flourishing at all. Where's God in that life? And I wouldn't want to overstate this, because I take your point, but I also think there are issues around the fact that the evolutionary process is so full of extinction. So when I give this talk, usually what I do is I go through all these and I explain why none of these ways out will work, and then I produce, like a rabbit out of the hat, my own preferred theological approach. But I thought perhaps I wouldn't do that this evening, not with such a sophisticated and savvy audience as this. I thought I would come clean and lay out my rabbit and see what you think of it. But we can, by all means, come back to these other solutions later, particularly if you're dissatisfied with mine. Okay? So what I offer is what I call a compound theodicy. That is, it rests on several different steps taken together. It rests on reflection on the whole trajectory of Christian thought from creation through to redemption. It doesn't rest on any one single move. So although there are problems with all these moves I'm going to offer you, I hope that the package taken together may offer you a way forward. So my first suggestion is that God, we were talking earlier on in Vincent's class about this, that God could not have created anything like biological cells except by a process of evolution. A process, as we've seen, full of suffering. Now, if you're a philosopher of religion, you're inclined to think that can't be right because God can do anything that God chooses. But if you're trained in the biological sciences, I think your instincts are with me. And if you stopped 100 biologists on the freeway down to Minneapolis and asked them, can you have biological existence without this sort of level of suffering? 99.5 of them would tell you, no, you can't. It's a package deal. This is the only way to have biological life, and so if God desired to have the sorts of creaturely existence that we see on this planet, this was the only way that God could go about it. I can't prove that to you, but I think it's a compelling possibility which I offer you for what it's worth. Also, I have to suggest to you a variance I understand with the great sweep of the Christian tradition, but I want to suggest to you that God is present with, experiences in a profound way, suffers with the suffering of all suffering creatures. That with the antelope, God is with both the cheetahs and the antelope. God experiences all the distress that the antelope experiences. God experiences all the distress of the starving pelican chick. No creature dies alone, but only ever with the intimate companionship of God. It's a curious picture, isn't it? Because I'm wanting to persuade you that God both delights in the skill of the cheetah and suffers in the suffering of the prey animal. But I think it's essential to say that sort of thing if one wants to make any progress in this area. I'm a very old-fashioned Christian, as maybe you might be, well, I don't know whether you think that or not, but I think that, and I take the old-fashioned notion that Jesus' cross and resurrection is the hinge of history. It is what separates the age of creation from the age of the eschaton. It is what begins the process by which creation is healed. So we belong now to the eschatological age.
Why is that not nonsense? I mean, look at factory farming. Look at the way animals are treated in the industrialized world. Industrialization doesn't seem to be going away. I mean, if anything, it seems that the current trajectory of the world is towards intensification of the suffering through human agency. I don't understand why that claim is not nonsense.
Fair enough.
That this is the beginning, that the moment of Christ's crucifixion is the beginning of the healing of all creation. It seems to me that the trajectory is quite the opposite.
No, that's fair enough. And indeed, when I look at the 2,000 years since the cross, and I look at the struggles of the Christian church to make any sense of the gospel, and I look indeed at the profound structural wickedness of the world, I conclude from that it's very early days in the healing of creation. But the other thing I want to hold going back to that, what for me is a crucial passage in Romans chapter 8, when Paul speaks of the liberation of creation awaiting the freedom of the glory of the children of God. In other words, for some reason, the healing of creation, its final consummation, awaits human beings getting their act together, coming into their true nature under God. And we're in that phase in which everything is depending on human beings, and we're making, as you so rightly say, a tremendous foul up of it at the moment. Really because we have utterly failed to see ourselves as the free creatures of which the gospel speaks, but we're trapped in our various forms of selfishness, greed, and violence that have entrapped human beings through the centuries. So, yeah, please.
Well, to make matters worse, so to speak, Christians have not held this view and have actually been worse off than non-Christians.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, that is one of the great failures of the church, I think, is that it's been so slow to realize its God-given call to address creation care, for sure. I couldn't agree with you more. So I think we might have established that if I am right, it's very early days in this project of the healing and transformation of human beings. But I believe the New Testament is wanting to say that this is the eschatological age and the age of the transformation of human beings, and it's just proving unimaginably slower and more difficult than the New Testament writers imagined. But it is our role in the eventual deliverance of creation, I believe, to be profoundly important. But I also think, quite independent of human beings, I'm inclined to think that God does offer a new life to those creatures that knew no flourishing in this life. So I do think with J. McDaniel, who wrote a beautiful book about this subject, I do think that there's such a thing as pelican heaven, where the insurance pelican chick can go and have pelican existence in its fullness. And I think there are all sorts of reasons why Christians should believe in some form of heaven for other animals, and I'm surprised it hasn't been more intrinsic to Christian thought, though certain key thinkers like Wesley, for instance, have held to this notion, and some contemporary thinkers also are very convinced of this. So there is compensatory heaven for the insurance pelican chick, I want to say. Please.
Well, I'm just thinking about kind of the fundamental biblical insight, self-reflection of those multitudes of generations that have gone through covenant with God. It is fundamentally the awareness of radical weakness, that in the condition of radical weakness, in the condition of near obliteration, God comes through. That's the story of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And also radical marginality, a group of people that barely have any kind of status in the world at all. But somehow God does the belief that God works there.
Mm-hmm.
That's where God will go to work, in the human spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you translate that evolutionary or biological, I don't know, but it just seems to me like this is a place where the human reflection on suffering, the reality of human suffering, really must distinguish itself from the general suffering of the biological world.
Yes, I do think that too, not least because not least because human suffering is tied up with our relationship with God, I believe, in much more complex ways than in any other creature, and it's tied up also with the passion of Jesus for us. Yes. But I think God comes through for the insurance pelican chick, as I was saying, not in this life, but in another. So, lastly, I get in a lot of trouble for all these moves, but this might be the one that you like the least. Lastly, I want to say that not only does the healing of creation depend on our coming into our true nature and our true freedom, but that an index of that would be our cooperation with God in the healing of the world. And I want to suggest that a possible way in which we might show that in this connection would be by seeking to minimize or even to bring to an end the phenomenon of biological extinction, a phenomenon which was a necessary part of the age of creation, but which will, I believe, be ended in the age of the eschaton. So I think what we're actually doing is intensifying, accelerating the process of extinction, which is perhaps 1,000-fold its background rate. And what I think our calling should be instead is to reduce it, in fact, below its background rate. And we're so hugely far from that. But yet our instincts are, some of our instincts are in the right direction. In Vincent's class this morning, a student was asked if she was happy to let pandas go extinct, that very incompetent animal, the panda, and she just didn't want to do it, you know, and it's just an index that actually we do have that sense that extinction is something that we ought to be doing something about. It's just the way we actually run the planet is all the other way. So that's in a way is the passage that got me started on this whole exploration, and I just rehearsed the sense that indeed, in this age of which Paul is talking, the age in which creation waits with eager longing and groans with labor pains to give birth to a new set of possibilities, it is human beings coming into their true freedom that is the necessary precursor to the liberation of creation. So I didn't tell you why, for once, why I thought everyone else in this field was wrong. I have offered you my composite rabbit, and I now would be very keen to enter into further conversation to see what points you have to make. So thank you very much for your attention. There's a question immediately at the back, and then, yeah, sir. Yeah. That's a great question, and this is really important to my scheme to understand what I'm driving at here. Because my my approach does depend on the notion that the first age, the age of creation, is superseded at the resurrection by the eschatological age, in which some of the necessary processes that God put in place in the first age become transformed, and which God has to do almost all the work, but we perhaps have a tiny part in assisting God. So, does that make sense? Yeah, thank you. Vincent.
Chris, I love your book, and I love the way that you work this all out, but I keep thinking about the problem of, so what is God's ultimate purpose? And where is it all going? Is there some direction here? Now, as a biologist, I don't think that you see an evident purpose in biology and evolution. It seems to be randomly working its way out. But you do obviously have a kind of a solution here, but my problem with the solution that you work out for suffering is that it all kind of has to come to its, its denouement after death. So the pelican will get some fulfillment, the insurance chick will get some fulfillment at the eschaton. Suffering creatures will get some fulfillment at the eschaton. And that's all very well, but the danger I see there is that it's almost as though it's pie-in-the-sky religion. Well, okay, don't worry about it, just suffer now, but don't worry, God will work it out in heaven. And I don't like to see religion that way. I like to see religion as also providing direction and purpose and fulfillment here and now. Are you abandoning that notion of fulfillment and purpose here and now, or because I guess that's what I would like to see also incorporated into your scheme of why does God permit suffering? Well, aren't some of the fulfillment we can do here and now and in this life as we have it, and that maybe even for animals, although how you work that out, I don't know.
Well, there's all sorts of flourishing and fulfillment in the lives of other animals, for sure. And there is tremendous beauty and richness in God's creation, which is part of God's purposes for it, that it should flourish and abound and diversify and praise God in all its diversity and beauty. I mean, that's the kind of meaning bit. I'm not sure. I mean, we were talking over here about God's engagement with human suffering, and I think that is a bit different because the telos of the human being is Christ-likeness rather than which is something more profound and complex than the flourishing of other creatures. Yeah?
Well, I like your idea, for instance, that there's nothing wrong with the gospel. It's just that we haven't tried it yet.
Yeah.
And so, I'm very sympathetic with that idea. But surely then, as we try it a bit more, we ought to be able to, even for suffering creatures and suffering human beings, be able to find in that suffering somehow some fulfillment here and now in this life. I realize that you're saying that for the insurance pelican chick, that's going to be pretty meager.
Yes, I think.
Don't we have to say that, for instance, well, at least for the other pelicans, there's some.
Oh well, yeah. There's meaning in that there's an evolutionary successful strategy which has kept the species in business for 30 million years. I mean, I wouldn't want to underrate the relationship between God and the suffering creature. And Barth, in his passage on creaturely praise of God, says a very interesting thing about how perhaps the praise of God is at its greatest in extremis, and maybe there's something quite special going on between God and the suffering creature. But we know so little about it. I wouldn't want to make too much of it, I think. Yeah. So I think it was a question. Yeah, Nick. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the holy image of God within creation, with the animal world, the world, and the plant world. But do we think, first of all, we need to be co-redeemers regarding other people?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
And right now, that may take all of the energy we have and more wisdom than we have.
I think it's a both and, isn't it? I mean, I think that if we're going to be wise stewards of the planet, that's going to involve issues of human justice all over the place, as well as issues of wisdom in regard to habitats and extinction and so on. And I think that the two must always go together. And actually though Christianity has such a poor record, actually the coupling of the themes of justice, peace and integrity of creation was a real strength, I think, of Christian thought as the environmental movement developed. And they must go together. Where you get the very, very tricky decisions, of course, are where the habitat of a rare and beautiful creature like the tiger conflicts with the interests of the human beings in its neighborhood. And there you get really, really difficult issues in ethics, for sure. Yeah, and there I agree. Yes, please.
Chris, I have just two things I'd like to talk to you on. On your first point of this is the only way argument, are you then convinced that you are basically giving up on traditional theism of God as all powerful and all omniscient? Because it seems to me that you're deeply rooted in God's power, that God cannot create without him. And then the second one, the co-suffering of God and suffering creatures. I've done a lot of research on extreme trauma. And so the suffering that really deeply concerns me is what theologians call the irredeemable suffering, where the suffering envelops you and debilitates to such an extent that you cannot
Yeah.
transcend suffering.
Yes.
So with God, God can be present in experiencing the suffering, but God is always more than and
Yes.
transcending. So
Yes.
the question is, does God ever suffer in that deep way? And if you could show me that God is suffering in that irredeemable way, I think I would get some consolation, but at the moment, I'm not feeling like God's suffering in that deep right way.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, those are excellent questions, Jennifer. Thank you for both of them. On the only way argument, this does jeopardize, seem to jeopardize classical notions of omnipotence. I suppose what I'm saying is that I think it's a logical impossibility for God to create these sorts of selves without the process of evolution. So if it's a logical impossibility, then it's not a charge against omnipotence, because God couldn't do what is logically impossible to do. My problem is I can't show you the logic by which there's a logical impossibility. I just have to ask you to guess that. One other thought I've been toying with, and I'd be really interested in your response to this. I was just thinking yesterday, maybe this is not just the only way to give rise to biological cells, but maybe it was the only way in which there could evolve a creature in which the Godhead could be incarnate in such a way as, through suffering, to transform the world. In other words, there could be an only way argument in relation to redemption as well as in relation to creation. So maybe that's just a bit worth thinking about. Secondly, I absolutely agree with you that always the difficulty about talking about divine passibility is that God's self is not destroyed by suffering in the way that selves can, as you know so well from your own work, can be destroyed. But yet we see at the cross, I believe, the extremity of divine suffering, and that's my character witness to divine suffering, however contentious and difficult that issue might be. Yeah. I think over here.
I'm just struggling with, I guess I'll play, for lack of a better term, a devil's advocate. Take all the living creatures on the planet right now, a lot. What percentage of those creatures actually do suffer? I mean, in most large populations of African antelope, it's a very small number that get kind of weaned off the edges, kind of weaned off. But the herd pretty much succeeds, much beyond the reality of a little bit of suffering. And there are probably whole species that experience very little by way of trauma. A whole species of insects that don't even notice, or an intense bioregion that Dr. Wilson talks about. I mean, it all seems to be very harmonious. I'm sure there's need for suffering, but for the most part, everything's pretty much flourishing. And the suffering piece is I think if you take all the living species on the planet right now, a very small percentage would ever actually experience that kind of suffering. Most of them would die in drought, probably more natural, drawn-out kind of trauma.
Yeah. Well, I'm heartened that you think that the problem is not as bad as I said it was, but and I don't want to, I agree that the proportion of species that have the sort of sophisticated sentience that gives rise to the sort of pain that I'm talking about, that's quite a small proportion of all the living things that there are. I don't happen to think that the deaths of wild animals are typically as benign as you say, and I don't think that death from drought would be particularly benign at all. But no. But I mean, so maybe God did a better job than I was making out. That would be okay with me, sir.
If we look to the gospel, and if we look to Jesus, I think we see two sides of Jesus that hearten me to a degree. Number one, I do think that he co-suffered. I do think he identified with all the suffering that he saw, that it became a part of it, that he took it on himself, that suffering became him, and he took it to the cross. But I also think that in his life, he sought to fight against all structures and anything that would oppress anyone who would be suffering. And I think that kind of dual nature of, as our calling as followers of Christ, both to take on the suffering of the world, but also to fight tooth and nail to eradicate all structures that oppress and harm, kind of work together in the life of Jesus. That the gospel is not just the other world. It's not just what life is.
No, for sure.
The gospel is an incarnational working in this to eliminate suffering here and now.
Yeah, and to come back to your first point, the suffering within food production is a big element in that, and I wrestle at the end of my book quite a bit with the issue of whether Christians should have anything to do with meat production, and there are definitely two viable views of that for sure. Dan, you were going to come back, I think.
Thank you. It was a really wonderful presentation. I have a question about what I think is an unspoken assumption in this. You focus on suffering, and we can all certainly relate to that because we don't like it. But that doesn't make a distinction between various kinds of animals, various kinds of species. The sort of distinction that Jennifer was making. It's easier to swap the mosquito on my forehead and not worry about how he felt, whether he felt anything or not. Do you see a sort of progression of dignity, or I don't know how you want to phrase it, among animal species, deserving more respect and concern as they become somehow more like humans? Because certainly, if we think what makes humans human, suffering is sort of like food. It's there as a necessity, but it's not what we think of as making us somehow unique on the planet. And yet suffering is at the center of your argument. So I'm just curious how you think about this and this relationship among different species of animals.
I do see a gradation of significance to the experience of individual animals according to how complex their nervous systems are and how individual their experience is. Though that's not the sum of their value, because some of their value is, of course, in relation also to other species and their ecosystem and so on. So I would locate the value of creatures in both of those, in the systemic and the individual, and I would see a gradation not towards the human, because so much of our thinking is much too human directed, but in relation to the complexity of experience. Yeah.
And why would suffering be a key feature rather than self-consciousness, self-acceptance, other sorts of ways one might make distinctions among species?
I think those two go together. The consciousness and self-consciousness, with the emergence of those, go and enhance capacities for suffering. The two are intimately bound up, I would say.